So good evening, everybody. And we hope you enjoyed the ride over to the university. Last night we were at the Diaconia Center, and tonight we thought it would be lovely to be at the university, given the role that our partnership in convening in Durban has included the university through the work of Prof. Msibi. Tonight's discussion is entitled Breaking the Backlash at its Source, Redesigning Theological Education for Inclusion and Dignity of LGBTI People. Please remember your hashtags if you're going to tweet, and feel free to do so. We really encourage that. I'd like to welcome very warmly those who are joining us today for the first time, and in particular, the colleagues from St. Joseph's Theological Institute. It's a Roman Catholic seminary at Sidara. I believe we have 15 colleagues that have joined us this evening. Where are you? Lovely. And thank you for your patience with us. I understand you've been here since 4:30. So thank you so much for allowing us to come in a little bit later. Tonight's event is co-supported by the Commonwealth Secretariat, and it gives me a great pleasure to introduce to you, you've met Gary Roeder before. He's here with his colleague Justin Petit, who is Human Rights Officer at the Commonwealth Secretariat. And tonight, I wanted to just ask Justin to say a few words. Welcome, Justin.
Great. Thank you, Bella. So as you've heard, I'm Justin Pettit from the Human Rights Unit at the Secretariat. For those of you who don't know, the Commonwealth is a voluntary association of 54 countries, 19 of which are in Africa. We work on various issues across our membership, and just want to say a quick thank you to Neville and the other partners for inviting us to be a part of this. We're very happy to support this convening and look forward to tonight's discussion as well as the remainder of the dialogues tomorrow. So thank you.
Thank you, Justin. We are here at the hospitality of Professor Thabo Msibi. Importantly, he is the chairperson of the Durban Gay and Lesbian Center, which is one of the co-convening partners of this dialogue. Thabo Msibi is Associate Professor in Curriculum Studies in the School of Education at the University of KwaZulu-Natal, where he is also Dean and Head of School. Professor Msibi has published research in Africa and in international journals and books, and he's the author of a delicious book entitled Hidden Sexualities. It's a book about the sexualities of South African teachers, Black male educators, and same-sex desire. He has been listed by the Mail and Guardian newspaper as one of South Africa's top 200 young people. He was listed by Destiny Man magazine as one of the top 40 South African men under the age of 40, and by Africa Youth Awards as one of 100 of the most influential young Africans on the continent. It is my pleasure to welcome him to the podium and to recognize that he was recently awarded a Distinguished Alumni Early Careers Award by Teachers College, Columbia University. Please give our host a warm welcome.
So there she is. Thank you so much, Bella. I really appreciate it. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for coming today. You are at the edge of campus of the University of KwaZulu-Natal. We've got a very highly distinguished panel that is going to be engaging today on redesigning the theology curriculum. This campus, interestingly, is what has been perceived as a Cinderella campus of the University of KwaZulu-Natal for years. But what we've been doing in the last couple of years is to sort of change the narrative. Unlike the beautiful setting that you had yesterday in the Diaconia Hall, with a rich history of struggle, this place actually is slightly different in that it is the direct opposite. This place, in particular, was an exclusively white college of education for many years. It was developed in 1968 as a girls-only college and exclusively white. Only around the early 90s did it actually start transforming when the desegregation processes started happening in the country. And in fact, it's been incorporated into the University of Natal, incorporated into the University of KwaZulu-Natal after the merger in 2004. And basically, over the last weekend, we had the first ever opening of or naming of our venues after black women. First ever in the history of the campus, because all our venues were named after white men. This particular building is called the Ellen Kuzwayo building. The lecture theatre next to it is called the Phyllis Naidu Lecture Theatre, and we've got another space called the Dalsy September, in view of the history of this place and in trying to transform the campus. And so it is actually quite apt that whilst we're doing this transformation process, we speak about how do we transform education, a space that is actually quite toxic in many regards, and a space that has been used over centuries to advocate for colonial thinking. We know, for instance, on issues of sexuality in particular, it was colonial missionary education that taught us that sexuality, African same-sex sexuality was abhorrent, and in fact that the African continent actually didn't have individuals who engaged in same-sex relations. When we knew for a fact that these were accommodated variously across the continent, there is documentation that this was happening right through the continent, but through missionary education, we learned that this wasn't happening. It was strategically erased through those processes. So it's quite an exciting space tonight that we're going to have to discuss how do we then take this conversation to theology and transform and change theology. I was saying earlier that, and I did say last night, that I am experiencing serious cognitive dissonance, because in our work, we trouble the work of the church. But in this wonderful space, in this wonderful creation that Nepo has made, we've been able to understand that, in fact, the church can play a powerful role in changing society, in changing perceptions, and changing the views of people. So I must actually appreciate the fact that you are all here as people who are part of the church and who are doing change within the church and doing such marvelous work. We've got a wonderful panel here today. I'm not going to introduce each of them because I'm going to give them a space to introduce themselves, what they do, where they come from. I'll start off there on my far left, and you will see when they introduce themselves just how brilliant they are. Professor Willetsan, let's start with you.
Introduce myself.
Yes, who you are, what type of work you do. That was me.
Oh. Okay, so I'm Lebo Mulekwane. I'm professor of rural education at this university. That's my day job. My afternoon job is as pro-vice chancellor for social cohesion at the university. But my main identity is as professor of rural education in the School of Education.
Fantastic. What she's forgetting to tell you is that she is one of those distinguished professors with international links all over the world. In fact, a pioneer in gender and education in the country. Give her a huge round of applause. Please, sir.
My name is Chabangu Kadining. I lecture at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. I'm both a systematic theologian and historian, and I also teach at the St. Mutitini Methodist Seminary, and I'm also a lecturer with the Dante Alighieri Institute for the Italian Language.
And a brilliant scholar at that, and in fact, quite pioneering. We're going to hear tonight about all the work that they've been doing in the School of Philosophy and religion at UKZN in transforming the curriculum to become more queer. Fantastic. All right, Nombule.
My name is Nombulelo Ngayizivele Khumalo. I'm a recent graduate at St. Mukitim Methodist Seminary. I'm a candidate for the Methodist ministry. I'm an LGBTI activist. I'm also a performing artist in and around KZN in South Africa, renowned for stage, if I may say so myself. I am signing autographs after this, by the way.
So hopefully there's going to be a long queue outside waiting for the audience, all right? Okay, let's go to Professor Brown.
Good evening. My name is Anthony Brown. I am an associate professor at the University of Johannesburg. I particularly look at the area of inclusive schooling for diverse gender identities and sexual orientations. I must say I was inspired by the work of Professor Thabo Msidi, Professor Moletsane, and one of my mentors, Professor Dennis Francis. They sort of supported me on this journey to where I am. At my own institution, I'm also part of the transformation space where I create enabling, safe, and inclusive environments for diverse identities.
And what Anthony is also not telling you is that he is doing incredible work in Namibia. He, in fact, has been invited by the first
Lady.
First lady. Why am I saying first wife? Or I'm doing a okay. So first lady of Namibia to possibly do away with all those penal codes that exist in the Constitution. So that is the next. Selina, please, ma'am.
So I'm an alumni from University of KwaZulu-Natal, and I work currently as a researcher at the University of Stellenbosch, and I focus on the relationship between religion, multiple religions, and different forms of violence. So I work as a sociologist, but also as a feminist theologian. And in my spare time, I potter around in my church. I'm a lay leader in my church, the United Presbyterian Church of South Africa. I'm on the Human Sexuality Task Team there. And I focus particularly on curriculum for youth within churches, curriculums around social justice and sexuality.
So, I think it's clear to us that you have an incredible panel that is sitting, that's going to be engaging with you. This is how it's going to work. I'm going to pose a question to each and every one of them, and the question is unique to the work that they're doing. Then I'm going to open up to 4 other questions that are just general, and I'm going to open it up to the audience for you to engage with them and ask them questions that you may have in relation to what they were saying or in relation to the backgrounds that they have. So let's start with Lebo. Prof. Moletsane, you've been doing cutting-edge work, particularly in the context of education, right? As now Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Social Cohesion at UKZN, can you tell us a bit about what this work entails? And I know that a lot of your work is dealt with sort of dealing with those traditional perceptions on gender and religion in the continent. And so what this work now entails as Pro-Vice-Chancellor, and how do we take education at the same time religious belief and sort of speak back to this backlash that we're seeing in the continent?
Can I start by contextualizing my response? Like Thabo, I've been publishing, so to speak, against religion because of my experiences and because of the research I've been doing. Over the past 5 years, though, my strong beliefs have been challenged by the young people I've been working with. So 2 short stories. The first story is I've been working with rural origin students at the University of KwaZulu-Natal and at Nelson Mandela University, doing participatory narrative work with them. So what that means is that they've been writing stories and creating art that tells stories of violence and resilience, how they are resilient against the violence that they have experienced. And many of the young people have said their faith has been challenged me, and how is that possible? But over and over, they've said, my faith is what has sustained me over the years. On the one hand, I still don't believe that the church is doing anything, or at least not doing enough to meet the challenges of young people. On the other hand, I appreciate that young people under very difficult circumstances in the institutions and in their communities can hold on to this hope. And I'm hoping that religious institutions and religious leaders can harness that hope and turn it into reality for young people. That's the first story. The second story relates to a young woman I've met in 2016. When I first met her, he came to a group that was supposed to be girls-only group in the rural areas, and he said, I want to be in, he was a heathen. He said, I want to be in this group because these are my friends. They are my only friends. So even though I had invited girls, I allowed him to come in. Over the years, between 2016 and 2018, in 2018, he came to us and said, Mamle, from today on, I'm Z, and I'm a young woman. You will no longer address me as whatever her name was. And so this young person told me a story of when his church, when he was still a church, when he was still a head, his church, his pastor called him to the front of the congregation one Sunday to pray for him and to cast out the demons. And she laughingly said, Mommy, brothers, after several hours, I pretended that I had received, and I fell over so that they could let me go. And to tell you the truth, I felt nothing. However, subsequently, last week, she was invited to deliver the Nkosi Johnson lecture at the AIDS conference that had just passed. And to prepare for it, her current pastor actually bought her a dress and shoes. That's how supportive her current pastor is. And she says that her pastor believes that God loves you, not because, but regardless. That's what the pastor has taught me. So with those two stories, I'm hoping that religious leaders would heed these stories and the hope and the faith that young people have. And bringing that to my work in terms of social cohesion, briefly, the work looks at projects at the university that address for me all the inequalities. So we look at inclusivity. How do we create inclusivity in the institution, but also in the communities around us? But for me, unless we address inequality, then all of the transformation, all of the inclusivity will come to naught. I think I can.
You know, this is so difficult because there's so many questions already popping up in my head, but then I now have to move on to the next panelist. But we'll come back because as we engage, we open up the dialogue. There are quite a lot of things in my mind that I think we need to sort of pursue further. Let's go to Nkadimeng. So Dr. Nkadimeng, you know, you in the School of Religion and Philosophy have been really pioneering in developing a queer curriculum and sort of thinking about a curriculum for social justice. Can you tell us a bit more about what your experiences have been around this development of this curriculum and what have been the pushbacks? We came to understand what forms of resistance you've received in terms of developing this curriculum.
With queer theology, the curriculum, as you know, any curriculum, especially from a university level, is always inherited. So if you come, especially as a young lecturer, you inherit from the older professors whatever has been given, and queer theology has always been, if you like, a novelty in the area of theology. And if you take it back, especially from, if you look at more traditional privately owned universities such as Catholic universities, Methodist universities, Anglican universities, there's a particular school of thought that is always promoted. For example, in Catholic seminaries, for example, you never find curriculum of queer theology. The only thing that you'll find at the most is to talk about inclusive language, full stop. Inclusive language when you're writing your essay or your dissertation, full stop, nothing else. Whereas at the University of KwaZulu-Natal now, a new curriculum is coming, but only looking at it also historically. Where does this whole curriculum come from? If you look at it initially, you spoke of theology, the study of God, and trying to know who God is. You go into philosophy and see God as maybe fire, as water, any of those elements that are more powerful. And from philosophy, you kind of have a logic of saying this is not really God. And you move into a theology which historically you had two kinds of theologies mainly in most of the universities, which was fundamental theology and dogmatic theology. And dogmatic theology is also another school of thought, whereas you kind of push a certain school of thought where if you, in the queer theology, you talk not only of sexuality, but of sexualities. And in more public or civil universities, like the University of KwaZulu-Natal, we have that freedom of expression. Whereas if you are privately owned, for example, if you get your teaching degree from, and I would say it boldly, from a Catholic university, so your license to teach comes given by the Catholic Church. So if you teach anything unorthodox or un-Catholic, that license can be taken away. Therefore, there's no freedom of expression academically. So in this kind of arena with the University of KwaZulu-Natal, the freedom of expression is there. So the curriculum can move from dogmatics and saying, now let's talk about these sexualities. And it's not only at varsity level, it already has to begin at home, where we can always talk about sexualities and say a mother talking to the son. That's where teaching always begins. From the home to Bible schools. If you think of your own churches, for example, the Sunday school teachers, what do they teach? If they're homophobic themselves, obviously they're going to teach a homophobic Bible school. And if they're going to use scripture, for example, my own taking, I always say I don't like people quoting the Bible to me, because the Bible can also contradict itself. And all the writings in the Bible are different schools of thought promoting a certain agenda. And therefore, if we put scripture and tradition together, then actually we can talk. Because scripture has to be taken with the tradition. In what kind of tradition was it written in? And who wrote that? From what kind of cultural basis did the person write? If you go to promote slavery, what was happening then? And now, with queer theology, if I had to promote my own curriculum and had to actually say this is my curriculum, I would actually opt for what I would call incarnational theology, meaning the Word became flesh and dwelt amongst us. Okay? If Jesus came today, the typical question that we used to ask in catechism school or in Sunday school, what would Jesus do? If Jesus came in this room, what would he choose to be? Incarnational. Let's look at the context now. Maybe it's time to write our own Bible, our own narrative, and kind of really come up with a new interpretation.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, getting very interesting here. All right, let's. I think the conversation Galiming and the Catholics Cabinet Galiming has just introduced. Perhaps Lubela, you're going to pick up on. You've just recently graduated as a student in theology. Do you think we're doing enough decolonization within the curriculum in theology schools? And I mean, maybe some of the things that you can sort of link to.
The first problem which just happened right now
Yeah.
is that my lecturer speaks before I do. Think about it, the fruit won't fall far away from the tree. So
Right.
I feel what helped me is choosing education as a stepping ladder for me. Being in seminary for 3 years was indoctrinating certain things, especially about a secular church, which I am affiliated to. But moving away to UKZN, where it's a school of religion, basic religion, it then became an eye-opener where now I see most of the downfalls of actually being in a set seminary. What happens is that if you're in a seminary for a religious seminary for a specific affiliation within the church, what happens is that you're indoctrinated with the normativity of the church, where you find that sometimes normativity makes you an outsider in your own affiliation. So what happens, what I usually found problematic was everything which was being installed in us and how we were also being taught liberation theory. And we're looking at it mostly in the scriptures all the time. And this person, James Cole, I liked it when he talks about, I quote, any talk about God that fails to make God's liberation to the oppressed a starting point is not Christianity. Think about it. Seminary makes you understand who's who in the zoo. Everybody is boxed, and there is no free will. So my problem with seminary, I'll start with the problems, we'll get to the good stuff. Of course they were. The problems there is that because of the normativity, nobody finds it necessary to deconstruct as religion has been written down and carved in stone, so that we just followers of that and we can't make amendments as we go, because if you choose to make amendments, you might just go find another congregation to serve. So it has been problematic whereby nobody is given room to destabilize that. And once you do that, now you are becoming a Julius Malema in the room. So sometimes it's hard to look at that. But then another point is that sometimes we as people do not research enough of who we are, what we stand for, and what we want to go. So now being in a space of seminary gives you a backbone of being able to answer and stand. It also tests your faith because, in fact, the affiliation of the congregation you choose to save is choice. And it's a choice you make consciously. I have an option whether I could have went to St. Joseph to be Catholic, but I stayed in the SMMS, in the Methodist Seminary. There's choice involved there. I could go on the whole day why I chose that. But seminary has its ups and has it down, but in terms of the material being taught, I think we're not being emancipated enough to rewrite the narrative, because the narrative written down there is people only talking about literature. People who have walked the way have not written down their narratives, and no one is giving them space of actually vocalizing it. I'll end it there.
Brilliant. I think in some way, again, there may be a link between what I'm going to ask Anthony now, because Anthony, in fact, he was not happy with me because I put him on the spot. Anthony has a powerful, powerful story to tell about religion and the role that the religion has played in his life, in shaping his life. And I would like him to share the story with us, but also at the same time to speak about his incredible work that he's been doing at UJ and in Namibia to try and bring about change through education. So how do you bring this religion that is sort of shaped you in incredible ways and this education together?
Thank you, Professor Msidi. I want to latch on with Professor Malatsane's two stories and link my own journey to that. Coming from Namibia, born to Catholic parents, mom and dad were Catholics. And mom and dad they are mixed race, both of them. And so I didn't have a clear identity being Zulu or Xhosa or Sotho or colored or whatever it was. But I come from a mixed race family where we didn't have culture that defined you. My first identity was in church. And my first identity was that of a Catholic child. And I grew up during the apartheid years, and the Catholic Church gave me dignity when I saw how those German priests would protest with us during the apartheid struggle. So that was my first experience of care and support through the church. I had my first sense of belonging through the institution of church, because back in the apartheid years, you had to be in a box. You had to belong to a particular race, and because we were not part of a race, the church gave me that sense of belonging. And years later, as a young man, when I discovered my sexuality and I started to express who I am in terms of that aspect of my life, this very institution with the values of care, support, and social justice was the institution that pushed me to the side. At one stage, I was denied the Holy Communion because my sins were too dirty to be washed away. And it was very confusing that the very institution that gave me my first dignity is the same institution that revoked it. And I struggled with that. It was the birth of my journey towards inclusive societies. Because I was excluded from so much and I so badly wanted to be part of it, I started to study inclusive education. And now my understanding of inclusive education is to create a sense of belonging, create a safe space and enabling environment, a space for agency, regardless of your background, your identity, how you orientate where you come from. And I've been doing, because I think the early identity from the church, the values that I've learned from the church, made me to believe that these values are real, I can work with them. And I use those values, not the ones where the church rejected me. I must say, I don't do church anymore. I do the values of church. There are some beautiful values in the church that still shapes me and still make me move forward, and I use that to support others who are pushed to the peripheries of society. I'll stop there.
Thank you for that answer. Selina, you've done close to 2 decades of advocacy work, particularly focused on developing new pedagogies for social justice. So, as you know, this type of work is not easy work. It brings itself particular tensions, particularly in higher education, even in the church and more broadly. What are some of the risks that you've had to go into doing this type of work, and how have you addressed them?
So I want to pick up on, I guess, Anthony's point there about the ambivalence is often encountered by people in the church. That's sort of both and. How can the church, for some people, be a place where they're embraced, but also a place where they're excluded? And I think as a sort of theological scholar working on issues of violence, one of the challenges I constantly come up against is that the church is deeply complicit in many, many different forms of violence. But the church also doesn't want to admit this. The church wants to explain how it's part of the solution. So a lot of my work and a lot of advocacy work working alongside the church and faith leaders is trying to open up spaces where the church has to admit its complicity, and it resists that. It continually resists that. And I think there's often a sense in which that's perceived as blasphemous. You know, those of you within the church must be loyal to the mother church. You mustn't suggest these sort of, you mustn't challenge these abusive images, these violent images, these God images. So there was a process for me of learning the language to be able to do that, to study theology, to actually learn how to do that. To not just walk away from those abusive images, but to actually challenge them. My early years were in the HIV space, where the narrative of HIV and AIDS as punishment from God was very, very real. And really needing to kind of find a language to be able to reshape biblical narratives, but reshape systematic theological narratives as well. And to be able to speak that language so that you're not just written off. So I think that's a key one to be involved in sort of theological spaces and in church spaces. A second one that I want to kind of point out, I've worked in the NGO spaces and also around higher education for a long time now. And I found I was working on one issue, and then another issue, and then another issue, all human rights related. But I worked on HIV, I worked on violence against children, I worked on gender-based violence, and in recent years working specifically around LGBTIQ violences. And the challenge with this, as a woman mentioned earlier in the breakout session we were in, where she said, I worked on HIV 20 years ago, and now I'm hearing exactly the same issues come up. Do we have to go back again and wait another 20 years for the same issues? And one of the things that I see in the NGO sector in particular is that we make progress on one issue, but we remain in our silos. So we make progress, the church makes progress on HIV over here, and then a new issue comes up, and we start again. We're like back to the beginning again. And my sense is that this is perpetuated by working in silos in special interest groups. And I think one way that we're moving towards that is to take an intersectional approach. And the real need for us to work intersectionally, for us to recognize the root causes and root sources of these violences, and to recognize the way in which the church is often indirectly and directly reinforcing those sources. And it's sort of theologies of domination, of one group being better than another group, whether that's white people better than black people, male people better than female people, straight people better than queer people, rich people better than poor people. We have to kind of go to this heart, in a sense, of this, or else what happens is that we continue to go back to the beginning. And then we really don't move forwards, or we don't move forwards fast enough. And then the third one, probably just a somewhat pragmatic one. I think you take risks when you play with pedagogy. So I work a lot with young people. I work with children in my church. So I have a lot of morally panicked parents. What is she saying to our children? What boundaries is she crossing? And, I think a safe way to stay in education spaces is to make it all about the head. I'm going to teach you about things. We're just going to bounce ideas around. But I think a more powerful way to teach and a powerful way to engage in the church spaces is to look at that formation, is to bring emotions into that space, is to ask people to learn with their hearts and to act with their feet, and not just to think in their heads. And I think that creates a very disruptive space. I think as an educator, there's responsibilities there about how you hold that space. But it's also about saying, what are we educating for? And I'm sure this topic's going to come up again, but for me, I'm very influenced by bell hooks. How do we teach to transgress? And that means we deliberately are willing to create a disruptive space. And that can be very disorientating, especially maybe in a South African context where there's very specific historical tensions in a number of ways, that we choose to take the lid off those. And that can get pretty messy. But if we don't, I think we have a lovely conversation in our heads, and nothing really changes. And I think churches are places where those can happen, but we need to be brave.
Now, I think in many ways, those last comments, in many ways, I think as to the next sort of questions, because I think in many ways, this transgressive teaching is one of the permeating things, being a juju in the classroom, being disruptive. But we are talking about doing this work in multiple localities. So Africa is diverse. Africa has got multiple countries, each of which have got their own complexity. And of course, we work in multiple spaces beyond just Christianity. How? There was a conversation earlier when you were talking about expectations this morning. Practically, what do? We don't want a talk show, the comment was. Panelists, how do we do it? How do we practically get to a space where we address the issue of homophobia in the continent within the theology education that is on offer, at the same time appreciating that nations are sovereign, appreciating the politics of aid from the US, and of course, appreciating the politics of exceptionality that we think South Africa has.
sexuality. First and foremost, that's what I am, a human being. When Anthony was talking, I felt my experience is way different from that because I believe I was first born with my DNA, and my DNA is my sexuality as I was born intersex. So that's the first thing I actually relate with. Secondly, I was born into a family of Zulus. The first narrative I was told about was that my father had to loosen up his belt so that my mother could deliver me because complications. That's the Zulu myth they go around about. But that was culture right there, which is the narrative of my story being born. Then a few weeks afterwards, I was christened and blessed. So I was then introduced to religion after life I had life. So in that perspective, I'm saying we have now taken religion off another cultural religion because, come on, Christianity is Jewish. We're following a Jew who was born and died a Jew. And I'm Zulu, like that. So now we have allowed Christianity to dominate all these things which were there before I was a Christian. There are so many values, as we say, we can adapt and live within Christianity. But it shouldn't be the cutthroat which will tell us that we are not valuable or dignified to claim our humanity in life. I think first and foremost, we should just be humans before sexual beings. That's my point.
I think at the moment we've actually reached a Kairos moment, and not only in South Africa but on the African continent. And if you think post-1994, post-apartheid era, the Kairos document came out, and as Dr. Alan Bussard mentioned yesterday, apartheid was declared a sin, a heresy, and a blasphemy. And if we have to remove homophobia, especially from churches, the churches has to have a very powerful voice of declaring publicly that homophobia is a sin, is a heresy, and is blasphemy. And if the church can do that, then all of us can say we belong to this church, which is the body of Christ. That's the first thing. The second thing is for people who write narratives such as the book of Siakuma, you have to be gay to know God. It's already a narrative which is new. But those voices are voices of, if you think of the early church martyrs, they decided to be martyrs. And a martyr is one who is a witness in the Greek. One who is a witness. And we need witnesses. And if we're going to just sit back and say, we are being attacked, but you don't actually come out as a witness. And witnessing means, first of all, in other countries, you become a red martyr, meaning that you die. They actually kill you. Or you become a white martyr, meaning you suffer from depression, you eventually commit suicide, whatever the case might be. But earlier on, also this morning, we spoke about, in my group particularly, we spoke about dialogue, and the most important thing was listening, which I actually disagree with, because I can listen to you but may not hear you. And the first commandment that we have all been taught from the 10 commandments, which you always get wrong, even if I asked you, and I'm sure you get it wrong, what's the first commandment? No. So if you think of it categorically, the first commandment will be, I am the Lord your God, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, right? That's the English translation, and the Zulu, whatever. But if you look at the Hebrew translation, original language, the first commandment is actually Shema Israel. Hear, hear. So before I'm going to give you out all these commandments, the first thing you must do is not listen, but hear. So if you're going to have any dialogue with any churches or even with the state, the first thing is don't listen to me, hear me.
I absolutely want to agree with my colleague here, because across Namibia and I think even in South Africa, I am invited to tell my story. Another part of my story which I didn't tell you was that as part of trying to be accepted, I got how do we use that as an entry point? And I think that for me has helped a lot in my teaching of undoing oppression.
I don't know, Otto. I think that we put, as societies, we tend to put too much pressure on the individual. Be it women, we want women to be visible, to tell their stories. The Anthony's of this world, the Z's of this world. We want them to tell their stories. But what are we doing as institutions to make their lives easy? So as I said, my work is to promote social cohesion in the institution at all order. But I believe that if we do three things only as an institution, as UKZN, for all of our students and staff, create for them a space where they have a sense of belonging. That's one. So if I come into the institution and look around this building, do I feel like I belong? I have to tell you, until maybe about 3 years ago, I didn't feel like I belonged to UKZN, and I've been here for 20 years. It's only in the last 3 years, thank you to my wonderful dean, that I'm beginning to feel that I belong. What about the students with very little power? What about the cleaner with no power at all? Do they feel like they belong? Secondly, do I feel like I'm proud of being a Mosotho woman? Just as an example, when I come into UKZN, do the institutions, traditions, value who I am as a Mosotho woman, or as a Z, or as an Anthony? Do I feel proud of who I am? Again, the institution, in my view, has been doing very little over the years to have people feel proud to be who they are and still be in the institution and be who they are. The third thing, which has people not feeling like they belong, is that the institution needs to create, I believe, what I will call functional services. For example, I've been working with young people around violence on campus, and young people over and over report that the services that are supposed to respond to incidents of violence are not very functional, and therefore they have no trust in the institution. So will Z, when she comes here next year as a first-year student, have trust in the institution that it will respond to her needs? Those three things for me are what or some of what the institution can do to respond to issues like this.
Just a very short point. I guess around the notion of multi-sectoral partnerships. So in a way, I think this notion of together we can be stronger. We have to work across different sectors and bring our different skills. And I think the danger is that sometimes the conservative forces of darkness are much more effective at doing this. So politicians and those pushing against legal reform on this issue ally with church leaders, and we see this kind of conservative backlash, and I think it's very important that we actually build progressive alliances, and this can involve sort of historic groups of people that haven't spoken to one another in the past, and I think it's very important that we're able to hear one another's stories, but also to be able to build alliances across sectors, and I think in places like Botswana, where we see churches coming alongside legal practitioners and thinking about how to shape policy, we can actually build a social movement from below. But there's a danger, I think, that churches sometimes either try and go it alone, or that other organisations say, "Oh my goodness, we can't possibly work with the church. Let's just leave them out." And I think we have to find those allies, and we have to kind of build those alliances,
because, yeah, the problem's too big. And if we don't do that, I think we'll end up being sort of divided and conquered.
But panel members, here's the problem. So we are speaking about the notions of the multi-sectoral, multi-stakeholder approach, intersectionality, telling the church and getting the church to admit that homophobia in fact is a crime. But if we are to do that, we have to also understand, as you've already all pointed out, that the church is very resistant towards actually admitting that in the first instance. And secondly, the church in itself is quite broad. There are multiple voices that exist within the church itself. On top of that, there are multiple other faiths that exist which the church opposes. Is it actually feasible at all to imagine that we can transform theological engagement? Is it feasible to even think that we can work beyond theology to include other faiths?
I think, Professor Tao, somehow we still have to, maybe first of all, begin with the definition of church. I think somehow we sometimes mistake church for the clergy or the hierarchy, the bishops. They are the church. But with them only, let's say a minister, I'm just one minister, and I'm now the church. Without you, my congregate, what?
So I guess I'm not sure who wants to answer this question, but the question is as follows. Considering the fact that, yes, the rule book and the Bible and all those wonderful things, it's easy enough to start, when we talk about queer theologies, be very cis-normative about it. Because then you can model yourself after this woman, or you can model yourself after this man in the Bible and all that wonderful stuff. But considering the fact that J-Dog's parent is like the greatest trans figure, where do you see mainstreaming and foregrounding of trans identities within theological syllabi and curricula, considering the fact that there are no characters within the books, that you can then say, oh, I as a trans-identifying person can mold my experiences after this? Because otherwise you're just leaving people to consistently sit between male, female, very binary when we look at theology.
Next question, thank you. Next question, please. We'll take the first three and then I'm going to ask the panelists.
Dumelang. My name is Kane Youngman. I am from Botswana. My question is in two parts. I try to write it down so I don't mumble all over. Is there hope for diversity in church when churches fail to hold each other accountable? Giving examples of the Doom Saga, families donating half of their wealth to churches, families breaking up because one of the spouses decided to cave in when the pastor said you need to donate to church, you need to give church this. We have cases in Botswana where some instances, for example, as one spouse donated to the extent of donating the kids' school fees. The kids had to be moved from a private school to a government school because one of the spouses donated all the money to church. I mean, when churches are that powerful, is there hope for us as the diverse individuals in the community? And also the last one, the last part of that question is around, is there hope for us also when churches have decided to remove Jesus from John 14 verse 16 and play that role that is elaborated in John 14 verse 6? And the last part of that question is around control. Why do we as human beings like being controlled? Thank you.
Good evening. Lenny Oko is my name, from Nigeria. What I have to say here is not necessarily a question, but a comment. And I have to make this comment based on what Anthony said concerning what he underwent as a Catholic. And when I was listening to you, I understood you because I think I passed through the same thing. And when I was passing through that challenge, it was as if I was going to hate the church or hate my society. But thank God I had a priest who stood by my side and he told me, Leonard, be patient with the church. One day, the church will come for you. One day, the church will hear you. One day, the church will solve your problem. And thank God, like I said earlier, I have been listening to so many people who have stopped going to church, so many people who now doubt the existence of God. What I have to tell you is that the church cannot be excluded in this struggle. We need the church. All we need to do is to direct the church, because we are like, I remember when Galileo came up with his signs, with the story that the earth was round. The church condemned him, the church imprisoned him, and at the end of the day, he died. But after so many years, the church now believed what Galileo said after so many years. And later the Pope, I think Pope John Paul II, apologized to him. I believe the church is learning, because the church is made up of human beings and not angels. And in one of the Cartesian doctrine of the church, sorry, I don't know if I'm wasting. Okay, thank you. In one of the doctrines of the church says, permit me to read, it says, the number of men and women who have deeply seated homosexuality tendencies is not negligible. They do not choose their homosexual condition. For men, for most of them, it is a trial. They must be accepted and with respect, compassion, and sensitivity. Every sign of unjust discrimination in their regard should be avoided. Now, this is where I want to take. It says, sorry. Okay, sorry. It says,
Giving you the space to say what you need to say, because I think it's important, given the conversation in the morning, that everyone must be heard, and I want everyone to be heard and to feel that they are recognized. And I can see people look at each other. Why is the chair allowing the comment? I want everybody to feel that they belong in the space.
okay. So, do I continue? Okay. Okay. It says, it has taken a great variety of forms through the centuries and in different cultures. It is psychological genesis. Its psychological genesis remains largely unexplained, basing itself on sacred scripture. They're not saying why they think is not okay. Basing itself on sacred scriptures, which presents sexuality, homosexuality as acts of grave depravity, tradition has always declared that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. But where I'm going out, it said, its psychological genesis remains largely unexplained, which means the church itself does not even understand. So it is we who are here that need to teach the church the right way to go. So if we say we don't need the church will continue to teach the negativity to the people, and we will never get where we want to go. So we need the church to work with us. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So I see there are like 3 or 4 hands that have gone up. Let me give the panelists an opportunity to respond, and then if we have 5 or so minutes, I'll give 1 or 2 people, and then we'll close. Okay. So panel members, who wants to go first? Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just go back to what one of the panelists spoke about, of how the Bible also contradicts itself in many ways? Here is a point where do we have hope if
just wanted to pick up on two of the questions. The one from Kat, I think, about the trans identities and finding role models. And now I'm not a biblical scholar, but I work quite closely with Charlene van der Walt, who's a Old Testament biblical scholar from a queer perspective. And I know she's been looking particularly at figures such as Joseph, that classic Sunday school tale of the Technicolor Dreamcoat and everything. And she shared with me recently that the word used for robe, the coat that gets Joseph into so much trouble, is only used in one other place in the Old Testament. And it's with Tamar, and it means the dress of a princess. And she's done, and various other queer theologians have also done some, I think, exegesis around this passage to look at the violence that surrounds Joseph, the violence from his older brothers, the favoritism from his father, and some of the particular words used in this, the idea of Joseph in his Technicolor princess dress, prancing around and eliciting a lot of violence from his male family members. And she just does a really interesting exegesis, which I wish she was here to share with you, but a fascinating exegesis of how could we reread this classic text where these actual words have been mistranslated and could be translated in other ways. And I took this straight into my Sunday school because it's one of those great, great stories, and everybody wants to be Joseph, right, and get the coat and whatever. And it was just so interesting doing it with a number of trans students that I actually work with, and they just suddenly sort of said, wow, suddenly this story makes so much more sense. How has it been possible to miss this? And I think just to highlight, whether or not that's the only way to exegete that passage, there are so many hidden and submerged figures and voices in the Old Testament. And I think as we learn to read contextually and read the Bible differently, we have to give voice to some of those characters that go unnamed and unspoken. That's often women. You'll often hear a story, about Abraham and Isaac, and you think, well, where's the mother? What would she have said? And I think we need to be much braver at saying, where are those voices that were silenced, those voices that were left out, and that were deliberately ignored, and to be bold at bringing those stories back in, and those gaps in our text, because we have to remember who the people were that were writing them and who didn't get included in the story. And I think Joseph can actually be a very, very, very interesting place to start on that one. So I just wanted to kind of share that. And then just around when churches can't even hold each other accountable, I think it's really important other sectors hold the church accountable as well. The church is hidden behind this sort of, we've got this religious freedom, so we sort of have an opt-out clause. Everybody else has to abide by these human rights laws, but we have like a special pass from God on religious freedom to like be crap human beings. And I think Laurie's story that he mentioned, and I hope he's going to talk about more tomorrow, is a really brave example of somebody saying, it's not fair, and I'm going to take you to court. And I think there have been a number of examples over recent years in South Africa where we're starting to see the church being held to account for what it does. And I think that's very, very important. And we need to sort of say, we have a constitution in this country. Religious freedom may be one of those human rights, but you can never hold that by ignoring the other human rights. These human rights are held together. So, I think there's a future where the church doesn't see itself as outside the realm of constitutional human rights behavior, but it's held to account, and that day is coming on all sorts of issues.
I just want to latch on to what Selena was saying. Reflecting on our journey with HIV and AIDS, all institutions, it was a multi-sectoral approach to make sure that the various institutions will not be guilty of discrimination and prejudice, because it was overt, open prejudice towards people living and affected by HIV. And here we find that this multi-sectoral approach is not present in the church, while the church is very overtly violent towards identities such as those with the LGBT constitutional values of this country, but the way the church sometimes acts as if it's above the Constitution. And because it acts in such a way, the church has this almost arrogant attitude that you will need to be patient. As you said, Leonard, we need to be patient with the church. We've been patient with the church for the past 25 years. And how long more should we be patient while people die out there? So I think in one way of dealing with the church is to say there needs to be a watchdog looking at the behavior of the church while they care for the souls.
Taban?
I just put a couple of points just to respond firstly to Katefo's kind of comment. I was kind of fascinated by how you kind of linked your question about characters. And I'll still go back to the whole point of why should we actually look for characters to emulate in the Bible for us to live an authentic or holistic Christian life. And if you think of the whole development of Christianity after the death and resurrection of Christ, we never, and sometimes maybe we are, intelligent as we are, sometimes we do behave like we are brainwashed, thinking that the Bible actually just came from heaven and boom, it was here. It only developed only later on. And if you think of Christianity developing, beginning from the Middle East and finding its proper development in Europe, with its own school of thought in Europe, and now all of a sudden there are Isaacs here and Jacobs. Why do you use these colonial names? Now all of us, just be Tabang, no? That's my African name. Now if you are Isaac, imagine Nebuchadnezzar. Those things just disappear. So that's for Kateko. And I think somehow, as I mentioned earlier on as well, that scripture and tradition go together. Maybe we so much focus on scripture and we find our own, as we would call it in theological circles, hermeneutics, which is interpretations. And we have to find proper hermeneutics in the curriculum, as we're saying, what kind of syllabus we're going to come with. And either the hermeneutic will either be a hermeneutic of continuity, which would mean a promotion of tradition, as it has been in antiquity, therefore we continue. Or, which I would opt for, a hermeneutic of rupture, meaning we're rocking the boat. So as we rock the boat is, now we've always had dogmatic theology, now we have queer theology. This is a novelty that is there, but it's part of us. The word became flesh, which is incarnational theology. That's for Kateho. And my friend from Botswana, no, from Botswana. Yeah, yes, sorry, my good friend. Is the hope for diversity in the church? There's two people who are wrong. If you think of, if you go to your own scriptures, Jesus, one man, Jesus feeds the 5,000 people, and nowadays 5,000 people feed one man. And the fault is on both parts, where the ones who are feeding this one minister are gullible, and being gullible is itself a sin. And the other thing is the minister himself is an imposter. And therefore also then we go back to what I was saying to Prof. Tabo, are they really churches, these things, or are they cults? And if you think of a cult is if it all rotates around me. And if I die, it means the whole church, so-called, disappears. Therefore, it's a cult. And I have the great opportunity, I don't know if I'm fortunate or unlucky, to actually teach most of your ministers, especially in KZN, from African independent churches and the Methodist Church. And the things I hear from these ministers, they are very shocking. But I have the authority, kind of the hierarchy being the lecturer, so I can say whatever I want to say. But I always ask myself, if in the classroom they can talk of such toxic theology, what kind of theology do they teach to the lay people in the congregation? What are you taking in? It's kind of brainwashing you. But at the same time, I also blame you. Theology is not only for the clergy. It doesn't mean you have to do theology to be a minister. What are the lay people? I think if you became a theologian and you came to a church with a minister who only has a diploma in theology, you'll be magnificent. So therefore, I encourage you, study theology.
Okay, thank you very much to the panelists. My question is, in this redesigning of this theological education, how far do we go in terms of looking at issues around decolonization and issues of intersectionality? Because queerness can also be can also come in the form of colonization. And also, are we in the process of changing the churches towards how they think, from how they think towards LGBTI people, and then later we will take on the struggle of how they think about sex workers. So how are we doing this? How are we connecting these struggles? Because some of us, maybe most of us, and I know the organization that I work for, always talk about intersectionality of struggles and social justice.
Just quickly, my question, Ma, you'd introduced yourself in saying that you're working with rural studies and everything. My question is, how are you starting the discussion around queer presence or within our rural spaces? I know there's a movement around empowering women in accessing of land. We are black, we're queer, we want land. So what is the movement there around ensuring access to queer black women in getting land? Then Puti Etuzewama, I just wanted to ask, in seminaries that I've been in, where we're having the dialogue around human sexuality, you find a lot of the men then say, if the church is going to accept homosexuality, why is it not accepting polygamy? I would like you to just speak on that, especially as you said, most of our ministers have gone through your teaching. Please, can you just clarify in terms of how have you shaped or addressed that little Achilles heel that currently exists? Ngiyabonga.
Mine's more of a comment than a question. I'm almost loving KZN again. I'm not moving back, but I feel, no ways. But I just want to say that I feel a whole lot better for having attended tonight, because this gives me hope that there is more radical people that have been around a while, and some, I think I remember you when you were about 15. So I forgive you for not knowing my name. But it gives me so much damn hope, because I think we were all brought up as passive consumers of religion. And we've just taken that shit on and made it our own. And we are so moderate in our response to hatred from religion that we sit around and accept the scraps off the table and beg to be heard, instead of mobilizing and getting ourselves organized and standing up against these arseholes that are doing this. I honestly think, and I just want to make one more comment, because this is the last time I'm saying anything. We've engaged in the politics of respectability, I think. But I wanted to make one comment from some of the things that we've heard here. And it's beyond me why we're not more radical in our response. Because if the emotional and psychological scars that we bear from the church were born on our body in physical form, you wouldn't recognize us.
My work in rural areas has been around HIV prevention, but also around gender-based violence in rural communities. One of the projects that we currently engaging in is around the whole idea of violence to the land is violence to the body, and violence through the land
my students or the ministers, some of the ministers that I teach, polygamy is what I would call the umbrella term. But under that, one of the terms that we always forget is polyandry. So as well also you see how women have actually been suppressed, being only subservient to men. But if you think of the early missionaries, I'm thinking of the early missionaries who came to Pietermaritzburg, Durban area, and they came from France, and they came from a tradition where polygamy is not accepted, and that became part of the narrative of Christianity, therefore one man, one woman. And I'm sorry for Anthony being Catholic, there's a horrendous paper that was, or document that was just released by the Vatican early this February, and the title of it is Male and Female Created. And I'm sorry if you go to read it, they can get some teaching apply. But with polyandry as well, with my students, I always see the downfall of studying theology without philosophy is always a problem. And philosophy actually teaches you to kind of use reason. Before you go, so you have reason and faith. So if you're just going to have blind faith and believe everything the Bible says without using reason, you're actually going into the pit. So the use of reason is, why is it that polygamy is wrong? And who decides that something is wrong? Why is sleeping with another woman wrong? And who said that? So kind of in this day and age, the moral campus has changed. Who determines that something is wrong? If I want to kiss you now, is it wrong? Maybe it's consensual. You might say she's married. No? But who decides that it's wrong? So it's kind of, for me, I would say the answer for you is kind of using reason in understanding exactly why is it that we decided that something is sinful. How did we get there?
Right, thank you. Yes, I know, Virginia, your question is not answered, but I think, so Anthony, Selena, please also answer Virginia's question.
I am not sure, Virginia. We'll have another conversation on this one. But I think we are on conclusionary remarks here. For me, an inclusive space is a space of social justice. And while some are going lengths to this hopeful space, and I call it hopeful because we've been hopeful for the past 25 years, let's consider diverse spaces that embrace the different identities that we find. Let's undo our traditional understanding that church is that building with the hierarchies and create those spaces where we feel affirmed and dignified. It does not have to be called the church.
Thank you.
Maybe just Sharon's point about be more radical. I think every person sitting in this room has a story that can transform. And you know, I think studying theology can be a radical act. And to move from that idea of being passive consumers of religion that internalize what somebody else tells you about your body and its worth in front of God. And to go all the way down on intersectionality. Like, I think it's really dangerous when we start carving up justice. And yeah, like we have to remember that in Christianity, you know, Jesus was killed for being a blasphemer against his religious systems of the day and for being a rebel against the political systems of his day. So, like, he went all the way down. So to kind of follow in that mold.